Hello, everyone, and welcome to Garbage Minutes, the companion podcast to the mid-season replacements, where we talk only about Winning Time, HBO's new series about the Showtime Lakers. Joining me, my fellow mid-season replacement, the man who rides the pine along with me in the podcast world, Sean Colletti. How you doing, sir?
Not too bad.
I had to sneak the name in that we didn't use in there somewhere because it was just such a good name that I felt bad that we couldn't use it.
There were a few good options that we had. It's just that everybody has also had these ideas and have already published those podcasts.
And in a moment of appreciating the beauty of spontaneity in the sport of basketball, I'm very proud that we were able to put our heads together and get a title for this rather quickly. So shout out to Team Chemistry, I guess, is how I want to open the show this week. And also shout out to HBO's Winning Time, which after last week's episode, which is not named Garbage Minutes, but will be named Garbage Minutes for the next 8 weeks. It'll be in this feed. Um, I enjoyed the second episode, which is titled "Is That All There Is?" much more than I enjoyed the pilot title, "The Swan." I made a comment right before we started recording that I think I wish that Jonah Hill would direct all of Adam McKay's movies, but I just think in general, in a broader sense, this is just a much better episode of television. Do you now, Sean? Do you think that's a case of? And I'm just going to assume you agree with me because I know I'm right about things. Do you think this is a case of Winning Time having some pilotitis, halitosis, or is there something different about the creative mixture and the pathos of this episode that makes this a better, more interesting proposition as a television series?
I'm not sure what I would use to explain what's happened. Um, I think I always err on the side of caution, so I'm going to remain suspicious that this is going to become something that I end up really loving. Not that I'm not open to that. I guess as soon as you say something like that, people will think like, "Ah, well, you're just expecting it to not be good or whatever," and so you're looking to find confirmation bias. And I don't think that's the case. With anything, whether it's TV shows, movies, video games, I'm rooting for the thing to be good at the end of the day. So I am rooting for this, but the improvements that you're touching on, and that I think we'll talk about in a little bit more detail in just a moment, they don't necessarily address some of the broader issues there might be with the storytelling. So even though we do get really good moments in this, and I especially like seeing young Magic just really be a dick, especially in this pickup game that he has with his ex's new guy.
Her Bible study partner.
Yeah, this is a classic kind of moment in an episode of TV where your response to it will kind of dictate what kind of viewer you are. Because I imagine a lot of people would have been rooting for that, for him to put that guy in his place. And it's to some extent fun watching him go at it like that, especially in the pilot after he has a failure at that party that he was at. But for me, and I imagine for you, this is more like, all right, they're showing that this guy is not all smiles, or if he is all smiles, it's not necessarily all positive energy, and that we're going for a more flawed version of this character that is going to make mistakes, and that's exciting. But that's just one character moment, I suppose. So I was looking more for the strings of the narrative to be developed a bit more, and I'm not sure about that. Part of this is I don't know even if it matters. But I'm not sure what time period, like where exactly this show wants to end as a series, and also on a season by season level. So it's hard to get a sense of that because you know so many events which have to take place. Like we still haven't started the season yet. We haven't really seen the Lakers play anything at all, no training camp or anything. So,
But we have seen Magic Johnson, you know, 10 years later, finding out that he has HIV.
right. So there's been very little basketball in this so far. And because of that, because the season has its own like built-in structure, it just sort of makes me wonder, all right, well, what is the structure of this season if they're not going to use that sort of at its core? But yeah, I certainly enjoyed this episode a lot more than last week's for the reasons that you were touching on.
I came into this episode expecting the series to start moving forward with the Lakers' 1980 season and bringing in Paul Westhead and trying to change the culture of the team and how that would start to have a blast, like a ripple effect on the larger culture itself. And this episode is actually something different. And again, I'm like you, and I hesitate into where I wonder if this episode is the schematic for the larger series as a whole, or if this is just kind of an inflection point between what the normal beats of the series are going to be. Like this series may end up being closer to what the pilot does than to what this episode does, but how this episode starts to pick apart these iconic characters and explore the kind of fortitude. Like I really like how this episode encapsulates this entire kind of journey of a champion, from being in Magic's shoes and being told that, you know, you need to be humbled and this may not work out for you and you might not be the generation defining player you think you are, to getting to a place of like Jerry Buss where you've moved so quickly through a number of successes, just enough success to keep you afloat, that you're riding high on this ego. And Jerry Buss is like, his ego and his drive is what starts to build this Showtime Lakers culture. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have this completely different story about Jerry West, who's on the other side of this whole experience. And he's a guy who's looking back on what he thought was and what he tells people is the greatest night of his life. And when we see that in the flashback and that opens the episode, you see that, you know, it's the common thing that you hear, that once you win a title, like there's everything kind of comes down in a way where almost nothing has meaning because you've achieved the highest thing. There's nothing left to achieve in your sport, hypothetically, unless you're Red Arborock and you're obsessed with the idea of winning and it turns you into a literal cartoon person. And that kind of show, a show that's going to explore stardom in that capacity, where it's starting to pick at some of the like masculine ideals that are built into winning and you know, mental and physical fortitude, that I think make for a really really interesting series. And again, it remains to be seen whether the show can do this in the long run, but I think we're in agreement that that is like a much more vivid, interesting series to kind of explore this group of characters.
I really didn't understand what was going on with the utilization of Jerry West in this episode because if you're just looking at it sort of without sound, you see several scenes throughout this episode really focus on him in terms of point of view. You get flashbacks to what his childhood might have been like. But at the end of this, I don't feel like any real character work was done. And we come to this moment where he's handing in his resignation at the end. And something that I'm noticing so far is that the series is playing moments as if they're quite momentous, and there hasn't really been anything to really convince us of how momentous those moments are. Um, so, Bus getting everybody at the end there and standing on a chair and talking about how this is going to be, and there's going to be some sort of winning culture, and it's a it's an easy way to sort of have a sly moment at the end where it's like, oh, cliffhanger, like, and it's a good moment of performance for John C. Riley, of course, but nothing's actually happening. Things are being hinted at that will happen, and so you get these moments that you'd usually expect to be in an hour of television that sort of bring in emotional resonance or signal something else that's important, and we're getting like the skeletons of those, and what's actually there is stuff that hasn't been filled in yet. And so I guess that also speaks to stuff that I'm looking towards, that I'm still wanting to see before it feels like a fuller production, I guess. Does that make sense?
No, it does, and I think with it's interesting because there's almost for a show that likes to be so big and loud, Jerry West and the way they develop his character in these first two episodes is almost in contrast because there's almost too much complexity to this character. In the pilot, we're introduced to this guy who all we know about him is that he lost to the Celtics a bunch, and it made him a really bitter, just a real asshole, you know? And this episode has the kind of conventional thing where we learn like, oh yeah, his dad was an alcoholic and he used basketball as an escape. But I think what really spoke to me about this arc in this episode is that it reveals that no, he didn't, like, he lost a lot, sure, but he did win a title. He won a championship. And that's not something that every player can do. And he even, says that it's something that he's been striving his entire life to. It's the only thing that he has used to escape this childhood of his. It's been his driving force since he was a kid. And he's achieved it, and he bangs some strange girl in a hotel room and spends the night alone. And I think that it's interesting because it really kind of praises him for being able to stand in the face of the adversity of that and stay within a sport and stay true to the passion of that. But it also kind of condemns him as saying like he was past his time in the sport, and also that when faced with this challenge of putting a 6'9" person who thinks he's a point guard next to one of the 10 greatest players in NBA history, like that pressure was just not something he could handle. And it's almost like the show is, I mean, the show kind of is explicitly commenting on Jerry West as a basketball player up to this point. Obviously, like, his history in the NBA is nowhere near finished given what he does with the Lakers and the Warriors as he goes on, but it's really interesting. And I really thought it was in a complex note to find in somebody that, like, no, this guy did win a title, but he lost so much, and he never found that clarity. Like, when he goes to speak to Kareem, and you can tell he doesn't understand Kareem's mindset and Kareem's approach to trying to find a peace of mind and clarity of his purpose on earth. Like, Jerry West can't find that. And when he's given that, like, turn this into a champion, turn this into something beautiful, turn this into something that will leave a mark on the sport for your lifetime. Um, he says, well, I'm already on the logo, and bounces. And I think that's an interesting way to observe a character, somebody as iconic as Jerry West.
But doesn't it feel like that's just done now? That that was kind of his episode, and we're not really going to get more into his psyche. That I guess that'll be in the context of assistant coaching, but um, I I just don't understand how. I suppose how the storytelling is working just generally in Winning Time. I'm not sure if it's going to be that kind of attention devoted to the character throughout the season, or if everybody kind of gets their own episode that, yes, this is mostly about magic, but half of this episode is going to be devoted to this other character. Um, yeah, I don't know if it's even worth like getting stuck on that, but it feels like I wanted to have a bigger reaction to the Jerry West stuff at the end of this, but this has only been the second hour, and I guess just pacing wise, like you said, there was way too much complexity there, so it felt like it hadn't been unpacked well enough.
Well, I think there's kind of I think the biggest thing working against it is that, you know, ostensibly at this point, Jerry West steps out of the Lakers story. He becomes a scout for a couple of years. He becomes the general manager eventually, but that doesn't happen for, I think when Pat Riley came in, they brought him in. So it was like I think it's 82 or 83 that Jerry West actually becomes the general manager. So like there's if Jerry West the character sticks around on this show, and I think it's a smart move to give him a highlight early on because the series has so much stuff that it needs to start to bring out if it's going to, like, even if it's just going to do this first season, there's a lot that still needs to happen for them to get to winning a title at the end of the season. Um and if they're showing us 1991, it's again, it's hard to tell, like it's hard to understand the scope of this season, but I think highlighting Jerry West now is important because this guy really, again, he becomes a scout, which if you think about where that would have been on the executive or developmental totem pole at the time, like Jerry West takes he takes a bit of humble pie in this experience and learns the game of basketball from a different way. And if the show continues with him, I think that foundation is there and it's established, and they can unpack that as he struggles to find his way and that path in the organization. So I think it depends on how they approach his story. Of course, his story as being a scout may not be where this show is what the show is interested in. So he may just disappear until he comes back as general manager. Maybe something that floats in the background, but I don't know. I would say that I think you may be a little quick to jump to that this is the conclusive part of his arc, but I think given just seeing the cast list of this show, that may just be a byproduct of having to script so much of this story into whatever these 10 episodes are or whatever.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine that stuff and stuff like when we see Magic with his mom and trying to buy this tub and earn her approval. Really, um, it's hard to see all of that coexisting. That something's going to have to give because for
Well, his
me,
parents will probably give because he's going to move to LA at some point soon, and they will eventually they'll have to get pushed to the back. There's no FaceTime in 1980, so you can't have characters, that are separated by thousands of miles sharing screen time frequently.
right? I guess what I mean is not necessarily limited to those characters, but those kinds of moments in the story beats, whatever could potentially fill in that part after he's full time in Los Angeles.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, because there are so many sort of big moments, and the series seems really interested in looking at those big moments. But for me, the stuff that's working best is stuff like the familial scenes in this. Basically, anything that happens at home for Magic, those are some of the better scenes for me.
Well, and I think that's a good place to transition to because we move from the episode's early scenes with Jerry West and growing up and winning a title, and then we cut to, this is not, I'm paraphrasing, of course, but we cut to Lansing, Michigan, where Magic Johnson's kind of he's enjoying his moment in the sun as the most famous person in his town before he heads off to LA, where he's going to be a very tall fish in a very, very, very large pond. And you alluded toward the story with his mother and him buying her a tub and her dissatisfaction with his commitment to this career, and she talks about him getting baptized and how he had no fear about that and didn't cry, and then juxtaposing that with her, bragging to everybody else in the family and the town about the cool shit that she gets from her son. Like, I think this another thing this show has done well is that in its most emotional moments with some of its main characters, and I think what I was talking about with Jerry West applies with his parents. They're making the most of the time they're spending with them. So if we're not spending the most amount of time that we can with them, I think with characters like these, this is where we're getting the best material of the show. And it may happen in smaller pockets, especially as the series goes on and more personalities fill up that space. But I guess that's to say that I do appreciate having these pockets in here because Magic's like the one character that we need to because he's our point of view character into all this, really. So he needs to have something established around him so we understand who he was before we see who he becomes, which this show makes the dumb decision of showing us in the first 10 seconds.
What was it about the direction that really worked for you?
Well, I think generally speaking, like most of this episode sticks to the same visual format, which still annoys me. The different filtering of shots I just think is stupid and I don't like it. But pushing a little bit away from the nonsense, like there's still some talking to the camera, but I think it's deployed more effectively here. I think how Jonah Hill frames the way he uses the camera as a device to convey emotion for some of its characters, like Cookie and Irving's mother in particular, the two that really stood out to me, but also with somebody like Red Arbach, I thought was really strong, and it worked in a way that allowed itself to be that kind of, I hate to say this because it sounds disparaging, but like I took a bunch of film classes in college, so I know how to shoot stuff in a cool way. But it did it in a way that didn't feel as empty and showy as the pilot episode did. I think I think there's a lot of purpose to and a lot of thought to how the most important sequences, that kind of the ones we've already talked about, were shot in this episode. Again, the scene with Cookie and Magic in the back of the shoe store, I think, was also really great and kind of showing two bodies coming together, but just constantly being separated by, you know, the shoes kind of can represent basketball shoes really didn't exist back then, but and God, I hope this show does something about those ugly Converse shoes that Magic wore early on. But I really like the direction of this episode. How did you feel about it in contrast to Adam McKay's extremely loud, annoying pilot?
Yeah, that's what I would say. That it fares way better because it's just not in your face. The presentation of it is just a lot more palatable. So you can get really high quality B stories like Claire Gabby Hoffman's character and what's going on with Genie Bus and how they're establishing those two characters together. All stuff that I think worked really well, but wasn't framed in a way that was really loud, I guess. It just fit with the rest of the episode. Whereas in the pilot, we were just seeing a lot of. I'm sure that if that scene or those sequences had been in the pilot, um, it would have had like a way more obvious feminist bent to it and how it was framed. And there was none of that here. It was just everything was felt more of a piece and cohesive. So it's that speaks to maybe Jonah Hill, but hopefully to I guess the rest of the directing team for the season. I'm interested to see different people tackle this if there is going to sort of be an in-house um, loudness and color that is like the baseline, and certain people dial it up and certain people tone it down. That would make sense, and I guess there's a lot of leeway uh, in terms of where else to take those stories. Yeah,
I think the direction does a lot. You know, the show, and it's something that we didn't get to talk about a lot because of how poorly the first episode did this, but I think this episode does a lot better with juggling just how large of a cast this is and how many, like, the show really wants to dig into this the vast amount of storylines that are available here. From, you know, they show a couple scenes with Norm Nixon here, but there's stuff alluded to that, you know, the average viewer is probably not going to pick up on, but brings in texture that suggests that there's a lot more going on here. You know, Spencer Haywood, Michael Cooper, different players that have just been mentioned that are really going to bring, I think once the basketball on this show starts to happen a little bit more, are going to bring a totally another different dynamic for this show to have to incorporate. And I think this episode was much more promising in how it was able to do that by splitting its time a little bit more evenly between characters, but still leaving room to have those emotional highs with Jerry West. I think I guess as we start to unpack this episode, what I really like about that Jerry West stuff is it allows for a pocket of like high emotion in an episode where there's still a lot of setting up to be done. And it would be easy if this episode was just 55 minutes of plot A, plot B, plot C, plot D, plot E, plot F, plot G, and it all felt like it was in the middle of something or at the beginning of something. It may be weird that there's the end of something happening in the second episode, but the more I think about how much is really packed into this episode, the more I appreciate where this episode chooses its places to explore those things. And it's not perfect. I still think, with magic in particular, a lot of the dialogue on this show still tells us more than we probably need to hear for some things. But that also, the big dialogue and loud dialogue also allows somebody like Michael Chiklis to come in and give us this vision of Red Arbok that I have to say is just delightful. I mean, if this it's not a tack that will work for every character on the show, obviously, but in an episode that seemed to start gearing itself a little bit more towards the serious, having something just as outlandish as the fucking cigar puffin, I'm ordering a porterhouse and a lobster for dinner, and I'm going to yell at you about how I'm the best fucking owner in the league or general manager, whatever he was at the time. I really think that this episode it hits the ground running in a way that the pilot just felt like it was tripping over itself.
That characterization is absolutely a smart decision for this show
He's
because
got the messed up hair and he just looks hilarious.
it just provides a really familiar archetype, just a really like classic villain to deal with. So I think that that's going to help with the broad appeal of the show, and you have an incredible actor doing it.
Yeah, it reminds me of like if we're gonna think about the 70s and the 80s, it reminds me of like something you'd see out of like Tim Burton's Batman films. Like Michael Chiklis's like Red Arbok is somebody I could see being right next to like, Christopher Walken's like mayoral candidate in Batman Returns. Like it's that big of a loud performance and it's
He,
it's
he
great.
played a lot like um, Falcone in Batman Begins. Who did that? Really great actor whose name I can't remember.
Was it that Eric it's Eric Roberts, isn't it?
No, it was somebody else. That's fine. Um, I'll look it up as soon as I'm done making this point. But yeah, it's again, people who go and watch these kinds of superhero movies and these sorts of things will, I, this character will feel right at home just based on this first episode, and it gives you something to root against already, which is nice.
We're so good at this. We've touched on so much of what goes on in this episode. I think again, there's not a lot of basketball happening, so we're just kind of trying to establish where the world of basketball and where the Lakers were at this point, and how Jerry Buss
Tom
is.
Wilkinson, sorry.
Tom Wilkinson. Okay, yes, that's right. That's right. He's the like the fake heavy of the Batman Begins. That's right. Because yeah, okay, yeah, no, that's good. Um, yeah, fucking what a well casted film. Anyway, we can talk about how Michael Caine remains the best Alfred another day. To finish up our discussion about is that all there is? I just wanted to kind of ponder about, and again, we've already kind of had this discussion about where does this show go from here? Because I think if there's a negative to this episode, besides again some of the dialogue being a little too straightforward for my liking, it's that this show has not established how it's going to pace out its story. I mean, we've gone from 1991 to 1979 to 1951 to 1972, but we still haven't started the season yet. We still haven't hired the coach yet. So I think ostensibly this episode is in September and the draft would have been in like July. So I guess it's a couple months later, but I don't think this show knows if it is trying to convey that it is a few months later or if it's a few days later or if it's, we're going to start the next episode and we're going to be halfway through the first season. I mean, through the first, like, the 1979-80 season.
Yeah, it's something that I'd like more clarity on. I could see a version of this where it's the season finale aligns with the point during the first season, once everything starts clicking, like all the pieces where they've had, some maybe some early struggles with chemistry or whatever it might be, and once the thing finally starts to look good, like Showtime Lakers, that would make sense. But it's because there's so much going on, because there are time jumps as well. Just too tough to tell. So that's something going forward that I'll probably be paying more attention to, is how they're dealing with the time frame.
It's got to go past this season because they've cast Pat Riley. Like that was a big deal for casting. And again, he's not the coach for at least another 2 seasons. So yeah, I don't know. It's weird. And obviously it's the thing is that like the Lakers arc across the 80s is such it crosses over so much of American culture at the time that it's the I think it's a problem that this show is going to consistently run into is that there's just so much stuff that you could do that I'm not sure this show has the discipline to know what exactly to do. Um, but I think this episode, if it's going to try and find a way to roughly corral all of that into something that is coherent across the space of 50 something minutes, I think this episode is a really, really good step in the right direction, improving the concept of what this show could be, in theory. Anything else, Sean, before we close out our discussion of the second episode of Winning Time?
No, just that I'm more looking forward to the third episode than I was the second, and that's a good trajectory to have.
I just want to give a quick shout out to a couple other performances that showed up in this episode because I think we should probably have a segment at the end where we just shout out the random actors that showed up in this episode because the cast list again for this is fucking insane. I guess this is going to be our new segment. So let's say we pick one performance an episode or one actor an episode. This episode, I am going to mention very briefly Sally Field as Jessie Buss because it was one of those what the fuck is she doing here things. Like she's this throaty voiced cigarette ripping like mommy accountant to Jerry Buss, and she only has one scene in the episode, and I think she's fantastic in it. And it just again it raises so many. It almost gives me more questions than answers about what this show is trying to be because like you don't just bring Sally Field in for like one scene every 4 episodes. Like that'd be fucking crazy. But if that's not the case and she is somebody who holds some sort of prominence, then what the fuck is this show actually?
I'll just give an extra shout out because I don't think we talked about her enough in these 2 episodes so far. Uh, Having somebody like Gabby Hoffman on this roster is such a steal. Like she's every bit as talented as somebody like John C. Riley, and I would consider him one of the most dynamic, versatile actors in Hollywood. Um, so you don't have her unless that character is going to have some incredible moments, and it's it's just good to see. It's also weird to see because like that was somebody that we would have seen as kids, so you've like really grown up with her, but like she's like an absolute veteran at this point, like somebody that you hire, like how you would bring in a veteran to a basketball team to like help develop some of the younger talent. Like that's exactly the kind of meta role that Gabby Hoffman plays for me.
Yeah, I think we're going to. I'm sure we're going to talk about her more this week. We're both fans of her from, most recently Transparent, but great and everything. I guess I should probably, just in case she doesn't show up again, a very quick shout out to Lola Kirk, who very very brief appearance as Jerry West's wife in this episode, and more a shout out because she was my favorite part of Amazon Prime's Mozart in the Jungle, which was never a good show, but was always very oddly entertaining to watch. And I think her performance on that was really great. And it's just again this show is going to we're going to be talking about this when we do the Not Emmys next year. There's going to probably be a award around some sort of cast, and this show is already in the running for it, and we haven't even seen half of the people that will show up later on. So uh, deep roster, one might say, for Winning Time. But that will conclude our discussion of the week for Garbage Minutes, our podcast about winning time. These episodes will be posting every Monday night through the first season. Our regular episodes, our fourth season is still going on now, of the midseason replacements, will also be appearing. All of it will be in one handy feed, which you can find on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify. Our YouTube page will be back up and running soon, so you can find us there. Sean, anything else before we close it out for the week?
Nope. Looking forward to the next one.
Awesome. It feels weird doing something basketball related. I used to have a superstition about making making a shot before I left the court for the day. I really need to have like a good joke or something to end a show on, which I don't have this week. So I am just going to airball a free throw and say that we will be back next week with another entry of Garbage Minutes. Thanks for listening.